The morning over Canberra was muted, almost silent, as though the city itself held its breath. A low bank of clouds clung to the ridges surrounding the airport, dissolving intermittently into gray wisps that blurred the line between earth and sky. The Lockheed L-188 Electra, a four-engine turboprop humming steadily at 16,000 feet, cut through this haze with mechanical precision, its polished fuselage catching fleeting glimmers of pale sunlight. Inside, the cockpit instruments glowed faintly. Each dial engaged a sentinel against uncertainty. The flight crew followed standard procedures with meticulous care. The navigator plotted the descent path, cross-checking altitudes and bearings against Canberra's radio beacons. Outside, the terrain appeared deceptively calm, yet the landscape was a mosaic of rolling hills, ridges, and valleys, elements invisible in the thickening mist. The Electra's approach to Canberra demanded precise alignment. Even a small miscalculation could prove critical. Minutes stretched with an almost cinematic tension. The engine's steady drone filled the cabin, punctuated by the occasional click of switches or the low murmur of ATC voices over the radio. The world outside was a blur, a combination of clouds and shadowed hills. Within this suspended moment, the aircraft moved toward a juncture where human judgment, mechanical reliability, and environmental forces would converge. This was the threshold between routine and catastrophe. Every decision, every adjustment mattered. The Electra descended on its glide path, unaware that a series of small, compounding factors were quietly steering it toward a moment that will be recorded in Australian aviation history. The stillness of dawn, the controlled hum of machinery, and the invisible hand of topography set the stage. A tragedy, methodical in its unfolding, was quietly approaching. The mid-1960s were a period of rapid transition in commercial aviation. Turboprops were bridging the gap between piston-engine airliners and the emerging jet age. The Lockheed L-188 Electra, introduced in 1959, represented this new era, sleek, fast, and capable of medium-haul routes with greater reliability than its predecessors. Its four Allison turboprops delivered thrust sufficient for both short-field operations and longer regional flights. Yet, the Electra also carried operational quirks. Its high wing loading, relatively steep approach angles, and sensitivity to asymmetric thrust demanded careful handling, particularly in adverse weather. The airline operating the Canberra flight had built a reputation for efficiency and safety in domestic service. Crews were well-trained, with strict adherence to standard operating procedures, but they operated in an era before modern automation and predictive weather systems. Navigation relied heavily on radio beacons, dead reckoning, and visual confirmation whenever visibility allowed. In early 1965, Canberra Airport was equipped with the standard instrumentation of its time, non-precision approaches, limited radar coverage, and a single runway aligned with the surrounding topography. Hills, valleys, and ridges defined the descent corridors, leaving little margin for error when cloud or fog obscured visual references. The Electra schedule for this flight was not new, but it was meticulously maintained. Maintenance records indicated routine inspections had been completed, engines serviced, and systems verified. There were no known mechanical defects that could immediately explain a catastrophic outcome. This left the operational environment, weather, terrain, and human factors, as the domain where potential errors could quietly compound. For the crew, the Canberra approach was considered standard but challenging. Pilots had to translate charts into altitude and heading corrections while negotiating weather that could obscure visual cues at any moment. Even a minor misalignment or lapse in situational awareness could turn a routine descent into a critical scenario. In retrospect, the flight operated within normal parameters until environmental and procedural elements began their subtle, cumulative influence. The stage was set, a capable aircraft, a skilled crew, and an operational environment that demanded precision. All elements were in place for a flight that, on paper, should have been routine, but reality would reveal how tightly the margin for error had been drawn. The Lockheed L-188 Electra was a sophisticated turboprop of its era, but one that demanded respect. Its high wing loading allowed faster cruise speeds, yet reduced its low-speed handling margin during approach. The four Allison engines were reliable, yet asymmetric thrust in a critical phase of flight could create subtle control challenges. The Electra's instrumentation was largely analog, attitude indicators, altimeters, and radio navigation aids provided essential information, but none offered automated terrain awareness. Pilots had to interpret every signal with precision, especially when descending through cloud layers or fog. Crew. The flight crew was experienced and professional. The captain had logged thousands of hours on turboprops, familiar with Canberra's approach patterns and the Electra's idiosyncrasies. The first officer navigator complemented his expertise, ensuring cross-verification of altitudes, headings, and approach procedures. Cockpit resource management, while not formally codified as in modern aviation, relied on mutual monitoring, procedural discipline, and shared situational awareness. Each crew member was trained to detect deviations, yet the human brain is naturally limited in low visibility, high-pressure environments, a factor that would quietly influence the outcome. Environment. The Canberra approach presented inherent hazards. The airport sits within a valley surrounded by ridges, with variable weather patterns that could reduce visibility in minutes. On the day of the accident, low cloud cover and fog created a deceptive sense of calm. Pilots flying visually could easily misjudge distance or altitude, particularly when relying on instruments designed for non-precision approaches. Topography dictated the glide path, leaving narrow corridors for safe descent. Environmental conditions required constant attention and continuous adjustment, a task made more difficult by the absence of modern ground proximity warning systems. Radio navigation aids guided the aircraft, including non-directional beacons, NDB, and distance measuring equipment, DME. These systems required interpretation, timing, and cross-referencing. Instrument approaches demanded that pilots calculate descent rates manually, track headings precisely, and maintain awareness of terrain elevations. While the Electra's autopilot could maintain heading and altitude, approach procedures at Canberra still relied heavily on manual control, particularly in low visibility conditions. Any small lapse, a misread instrument, delayed correction, or misjudged descent could erode the safety buffer with alarming speed. Together, these elements formed a tightly interwoven operational fabric. The Electra was capable, the crew skilled, the instruments functional, and the approach charted. Yet, it is often in the interaction between these factors, mechanical, human, and environmental, that accidents quietly develop. The aircraft moved through its final descent, each system performing its role, while the crew navigated the layered challenges of terrain, weather, and procedure. The stage was prepared for a turning point that would test the boundaries of human precision and machine reliability. As the Lockheed L-188 Electra approached Canberra, the environment closed in with quiet intensity. Low clouds hugged the ridges, fog thickened in pockets, and the city below remained obscured. The crew followed standard procedures, but subtle factors were beginning to converge. Slight miscalculations in altitude and heading, compounded by limited visual cues, slowly eroded the safety margin. The Electra descended along the published approach corridor. Instruments indicated the aircraft was within prescribed limits, yet the valley's contour and hidden ridges demanded constant vigilance. The navigator called out altitudes and bearings. The first officer cross-checked the captain's inputs, and all systems functioned nominally. It was not a moment of panic, but of quiet, incremental misalignment, a gradual drift that would culminate in disaster. At a critical moment, The Electra entered a segment where the surrounding terrain rose abruptly. The crew, relying on instruments designed for non-precision guidance, did not have visual confirmation of the ridges ahead. Human perception lagged slightly behind reality. The aircraft descent rate, safe under most conditions, now intersected with terrain elevation. A final sequence of corrections, small, precise, but ultimately insufficient, was attempted, yet the aircraft's trajectory could not be altered in time. Impact occurred as a single, discrete event, an intersection of aircraft, terrain, and procedural limits. The Electra struck the rising terrain. The kinetic energy of its forward motion and descent combined, and the aircraft came to a halt within the valley. There was no dramatic build-up, no audible crescendo beyond the mechanical inevitability of physics. The crew and passengers faced the consequences of a chain reaction that had begun miles earlier, within a matrix of environmental conditions, procedural constraints, and the inherent limitations of human perception. This moment marked a turning point. A routine approach transformed into a tragedy defined not by error alone, but by the quiet, compounding interactions of machine, human, and environment. It was a controlled flight into terrain, methodical in its mechanics, devastating in its result. In the wake of the Canberra air disaster, investigators moved with methodical precision. Australian aviation authorities, in collaboration with Lockheed engineers and airline specialists, began the painstaking process of reconstructing events from flight logs, witness accounts, and instrument readings. Every detail was scrutinized: engine performance, radio transmissions, approach charts, and maintenance records. The goal was not to assign blame in haste, but to understand how a routine descent had ended in tragedy. The investigation revealed a complex chain of factors. The Electra had been mechanically sound, engines performing within specifications, and cockpit systems fully operational. Environmental conditions, low clouds, fog pockets, and limited visual cues, emerged as a central element. Analysis of the flight path showed gradual deviations from a published approach corridor, subtle misalignments that compounded over time. Human factors played a role. Even skilled pilots are subject to perception limits, particularly when instruments must compensate for visual uncertainty. The combination of terrain, weather, procedural constraints, and situational awareness gaps culminated in a controlled flight into terrain scenario. The official report emphasized systemic lessons. Non-precision approaches required enhanced vigilance. Navigational aids needed integration with terrain awareness, and crew resource management, though informal at the time, became a point of focus for future training. Regulatory bodies recommended procedural revisions, including stricter minimum descent altitudes and clearer communication protocols during instrument approaches. Airlines operating turboprops with similar performance characteristics reviewed operational manuals to ensure consistency with these safety standards. Public reaction was measured but somber. The disaster underscored the invisible hazards of aviation, particularly in challenging environments. Media coverage respected the technical focus of the investigation, highlighting the importance of procedural rigor over sensationalism. The Electra fleet continued to operate safely, guided by the lessons extracted from Canberra, proving that rigorous investigation can transform tragedy into actionable safety improvements. Ultimately, the aftermath reinforced a fundamental principle. Aviation safety is cumulative. Aircraft design, crew training, environmental understanding, and procedural adherence form an interdependent network. When any link is tested, meticulous analysis and responsive regulation ensure that future flights benefit from hard-earned knowledge. The Canberra air disaster left a quiet but enduring mark on Australian aviation. Its lessons were procedural, technical, and human. Layers of insight distilled into tangible improvements that reshaped operations for years to come. Pilots were trained to respect not only the capabilities of their aircraft, but the limits of perception in low-visibility approaches. Navigation procedures were refined, emphasizing redundant cross-checks and minimum descent altitudes, ensuring that terrain could no longer be an unseen adversary. The Lockheed Electra itself benefited from operational adjustments. Airlines revised approach protocols, integrated stricter instrument approach briefings, and emphasized the criticality of altitude awareness. Although autopilot systems were still rudimentary, pilots were encouraged to use them in concert with manual monitoring, maintaining a delicate balance between technology and judgment. Regulatory authorities codified these lessons, establishing safety frameworks that would influence turboprop and jet operations alike. Beyond technical measures, the disaster reinforced a professional culture grounded in meticulous planning and situational awareness. It reminded crews that even routine flights demanded vigilance and that safety is cumulative, a network of decisions, checks, and environmental understanding. Each pilot who flew the Electra after Canberra did so under procedures informed by the lessons of that morning, a living testament to the analytical rigor applied in the aftermath. In the broader context of aviation history, the Canberra accident exemplifies how tragedy can catalyze progress. It was not a dramatic spectacle, but a sober, instructive event. The focus on methodical investigation, system evaluation, and procedural refinement created a legacy of safer skies. Modern approaches, advanced warning systems, and crew resource management philosophies trace their roots, in part, to lessons extracted from incidents such as this. The Electra, the crew, the terrain, and the environment all converged in a moment that reshaped thinking. Today, the silence of Canberra's valleys is no longer a hidden hazard, but a reminder of the vigilance aviation demands. The legacy is enduring, quiet, and profoundly instructive, ensuring that future flights carry the benefit of knowledge earned through meticulous study and unwavering professionalism.